Hey guys, it's Charlene. Today I am making a card with the I Love Dad Stamps and Dies, really cute stamp set. I'm also going to be using the Uni Alphabet Dies to create my own sentiment, as well as the Shooting Stars stencil. This is a really beautiful stencil. And then I'm also using the Borders number 9 dies, as well as the Scallop frame number 9 dies. And today I'm going to be showing you some tips on how to add some subtle shine and shimmer to your cards. So I'm starting out here with a slimline card size panel, and I'm using some Distress Oxide. I'm starting out here with tumbled glass, and then I am going to be using broken china. And after that, I'll be using Mermaid Lagoon. And so you can see I'm coming in here on the diagonal. I started with my light and then my medium blue, and then I'm going to my dark blue. I'm not doing a lot of blending at this point. I'm mostly doing color blocking here. And then I'm going to go back over with a second coat where I do my blending. The reason I'm doing this is because I don't want to have a ton of overlap where I'm creating a new color. I mostly just want the two colors to lightly blend together. You're going to see when the card's finished, you're not going to see very much, if at all, of that Mermaid Lagoon because it actually does ultimately end up getting covered. So if you're making this style of card and you want that bottom color to show, I would say bring it up a little bit more than 1/3. I only brought it up 1/3. So I let that dry, and now I am cutting it out with that Scallop Frames die, the largest. And here's a tip. I'm going to be doing some die cut inlay with the letters LOVE to spell love, and I want to put them in a square, and I want to make it a little bit easier on myself when I'm die cutting. So all I've done is I've added some dot runner to the back of my dies, and I've got a piece of scrap paper here, and I just line them all up and stick them to the piece of scrap paper. So that way I can get them nice and lined up in advance, and I won't have them moving all over on my card panel. So now that I've done that, I'm using my ruler just to make sure the bottom is straight, and then I can tape the paper to my panel, and now when I run that through my die cut machine, none of my letters are going to move around on me. So as I mentioned, I'm doing some die cut inlay here, so I do want to save the inside of that O, and I've also cut out the letters off camera in white. Now I'm going to go ahead and use some liquid adhesive, and here I'm just making sure to get all the way around the letters because you do want to make sure those are adhered down well before you put in your inlay pieces. So once I get that on there, I'm going to put it on my slimline sized card base here, and this is a pre-made base from PHOTOPLAY Say It With Stamps, these are just fantastic. I love having these around. They make card making so much easier when I'm not having to cut out card bases and score them and make sure I get the right size and cut them right and all of that fun stuff. So I really like them. They're super helpful. So now I'm taking those white letters that I cut out, and I'm using some liquid adhesive to inset them inside the cutout letters from my Distress Oxide panel, and it's super easy to do. If I was doing a lot more, I might have put some double-sided adhesive underneath to make it a little bit easier on myself, but since this was just 4 letters, it wasn't too much work to go ahead and use the liquid adhesive and stick those in there. You could use any color you want here. I chose white. I do end up using some shimmer paper at the end to add some more bling to my card, but any color you want would work well with this style of card. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and cut out another piece of white cardstock using that scallop frame. And then I'm going to use one of my border dies and cut it out to create a little snowbank here, you can see. So I'm going to pop that up with some foam squares in a little bit. But first I'm going to go ahead and use the Shooting Stars stencil to add some really subtle shimmer to my card. So I'm just placing it on top, getting it where I like it, and then I'm going to tape down one side on the left to create a hinge. The reason I'm doing this is twofold. One, I don't want to get any ink on the side of my card because I have this offset a little bit. And then the other reason is I want to be able to close it up when I'm done, and you're going to see why in a minute. So once I get that hinge in place, I'm using some clear embossing ink here, some sticky ink, and I'm just tamping it down over the top of the stencil. You do want to kind of push hard so you can get it in all of those little nooks and crannies. And this is a really fun way to use your stencils because you can do lots of different things. You could heat emboss this way, but what I'm using it for is I'm creating a sticky spot to add some perfect pearls. So I can have a little bit of a shimmery shooting star background that you're just really going to catch in the light. So once I've got that down, I'm just sprinkling the perfect pearls all over my background, and then I'm using a stiff bristle brush in order to brush it all around and get it to stick to all of those stars. Try not to stick your fingers in the embossing ink. I did that on one of the stars and smudged it a little bit. So just keep that in mind when you're doing this. And then you'll just want to use some kind of soft sweep brush that works really well, I found, in order to sweep off the excess that is on your card panel. Once that's done, you can just use the hinge to close your stencil back onto the card panel and mist it with water. The water is what sets the perfect pearls so that it doesn't rub off or smudge anymore. Now, at this point, I noticed from all the die cutting, I had some little like nicks and things like that in my card panel. So I decided to use some of the micro glaze. This is a sealant, and you just rub it on all over the top. And then you come in with a paper towel and buff off the excess. It does reduce some of the shimmer, but I still think it looks really cool, those stars that are on there. Now I'm going to stamp out my polar bears that are going to go on the front of the card. I'm using some alcohol marker friendly ink here, and I'm stamping onto some PHOTOPLAY Say It With Stamps cardstock, which is really good for coloring with alcohol markers. I think it is super smooth, so it works really well. For the polar bears, they don't require a lot of coloring. I'm using some cool grays. I have C1 and C3. I start out with my C1 and then I do a little bit of C3 and then I blend the C3 out using my C1. I'm shading where I think it would naturally be darker from where the sun hits, so around their arms and legs as well as on the bottom. And then I'm also going to do a little bit of shading around the edges. I find that helps create the look of a 3D animal rather than it being flat and 2D on the paper. That little bit of shading around the edges helps create that dimension so it looks rounded. Once I get those colored, I'm going to come back to my MISTI, and my stamp is still right in the same place. I use some anti-static powder, and then I'm stamping now with some black pigment ink. And then on top of that, I'm going to add some black embossing powder. I do melt this off camera because some gremlins ate part of my footage apparently, so I don't have the actual heat embossing on there, but you can see I just moved my MISTI over to the side so that my ink would still stay wet, and now I'm sprinkling over that black embossing powder. I like to do this because it just gives those lines a little bit more definition and looks really pretty. Now that I have that done, I'm going to pop up my snowbank using some double-sided adhesive foam squares. These are from Therm O Web. They're really great for using on cards. And then I'm going to do the same thing with my polar bears. I've added some of the double-sided foam adhesive, and you can see I sort of marked where I want to create my shadow underneath my polar bears. I end up covering almost all of that up, so I come back in with my C1 here and just run it underneath the polar bears in kind of a swooping motion so that I'm not creating too big of a shadow and have a little bit more control. I'm using some pigment ink here because I'm going to be doing some heat embossing. I'm stamping out 5 of the little stars and putting those onto a piece of paper, and then I'm going to use some black embossing powder here, sprinkle it all over, and then I can use my heat gun to go ahead and melt the embossing powder. I like to use black pigment ink when I'm going to be heat embossing with black embossing powder because I find that it just creates a more solid line just in case if any of that embossing powder doesn't make it where it's supposed to go. Then I also have the black ink underneath that fills in those spots so they're not noticeable. Now I'm using the coordinating die and I'm just going to cut out all 5 of my stars, and I want these to have some subtle shimmer as well, so I'm using some Wink of Stella and just going over all of the stars inside of that melted embossing powder, and it's going to give them some nice little shimmer in the light when you turn the card. I do also add a little bit of shimmer to the shadow underneath of my polar bears for the same reason, so that when you turn it in the light, it's going to look like the snow is glistening on the card. I really like all these different ways to add subtle shimmer. Sometimes you want the bling on your card, but you don't want it to be the main attraction, and I thought this card worked really well for these techniques. I popped up all of my stars with some more foam adhesive squares, and now I'm coming in here with that silver glitter paper that I was talking about because I wanted my letters to also be shimmery, but that's going to complete my card. You can see when you turn it in the light, you have the shimmer from the stars, the shimmer from the stencil, the shimmer from the letters, the shimmer from underneath those cute little polar bears. Unfortunately, it doesn't photograph too terribly well, but in person it is gorgeous. Thank you so much for joining me here on the PhotoPlay Say It With Stamps YouTube channel, and until next time, happy crafting.